In that silent early morning, the bank terminals went dark one by one. The lines outside the ATMs stretched down the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, and every face reflected the same silent question. What happened to our money? It was September 8th, 2025, and the financial heart of West Africa was beating out of sync. The CFA franc, a currency still tied to France, was shooting up 30% above the official exchange rate on the black market. In just 3 weeks, the price of rice doubled, the value of banknotes dropped, and fear became the only reliable currency. In the squares, the old folks commented that it was the end of an era. The young people asked if it was the beginning of a new one. From Dakar to Bamako, the continent seemed suspended between two times the colonial past and the uncertain future. But in the midst of this heavy silence, something was beginning to move. The crisis wasn't just about numbers. It was about dignity. And suddenly, the question stopped being, what is the money worth, and became, who decides the value of a nation? If you believe the changes in Africa begin when the truth is told, subscribe, and follow this story to the end. 3 days after the currency collapse, cameras from the White House broadcast an image that froze international news. Donald J. Trump, the President of the United States, walked into the Oval Office accompanied by Treasury advisors and Wall Street investors. In the background, an American flag and another with the map of Africa. Trump declared that the time had come to free Africa from European financial chains. He presented what he called the Afro Dollar, or Afrodigi, a new digital currency for the continent, backed by 200 tons of gold stored at Fort Knox and $10 billion in credit extended by major American banks. The plan included a continental payment infrastructure operated by Elon Musk's Starlink, with Musk personally leading the technical mission. The promise was audacious. Every African village would have direct access to a global financial system without depending on Paris. But while Trump spoke of freedom, African economists questioned the word hidden beneath the rhetoric control. If the CFA tied the continent to France, the Afro Dollar might tie it to Washington, this time with technology instead of colonial treaties. In the following days, newspapers in Accra and Lagos published cautious headlines: liberation or replacement of masters. The new currency comes with promises and conditions. And in the heart of the Sahel, a response began to take shape. From Ouagadougou, the voice of Africa was preparing to be heard, not in protest, but in decision. While the world debated Washington's Afro Dollar, a rare scene in modern African history was unfolding in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. Representatives from 25 nations of the West African Economic and Monetary Union (WEMOA) gathered urgently to decide whether to accept or reject the new American proposal. The main hall of the old government palace buzzed with voices, documents, reports, and tense glances. At the center, Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, opened the meeting with a dry, pragmatic sentence. This is not about pride, but about economic survival. The meeting quickly revealed deep fissures. Mali, Niger, and Guinea advocated for a controlled break with the European monetary system, arguing that chronic dependence was an obstacle to growth. Meanwhile, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, and Benin warned that a hasty rupture could lead to an unprecedented recession. Outside, the public followed on local radio. In the markets, the topic was no longer the price of rice, but the future of the currency. For the first time, ordinary people discussed monetary policy like they discussed the weather, because they knew the bread of tomorrow depended on this decision. By the end of the first day, no resolution was passed. Only a silent consensus hung in the air. Africa could not remain stuck in the past, but it also couldn't leap into the dark. The next day, something unexpected happened. Students from universities in Lagos, Accra, and Bamako took to the streets with makeshift signs, No to the Afro Dollar. We want to decide for ourselves. This wasn't an ideological or partisan movement. It was the expression of a generation that had grown up between foreign promises and domestic debts, and now demanded a genuinely African choice. On community radios, small business owners, farmers, and teachers began participating in public debates. A merchant in Ouagadougou said, "I don't know what blockchain is, but I know what it means to depend on others." This new collective consciousness spread quickly. The currency crisis, which seemed technical and distant, had become a mirror of lost autonomy. Political analysts noted that for the first time in decades, the discourse on financial sovereignty was not coming from the offices, it was coming from the streets. Meanwhile, in distant capitals, diplomatic reports arrived in Washington, Paris, and Beijing. All carried the same diagnosis: African confidence was shifting. And as the protests grew, foreign governments realized that the problem was no longer just the collapse of the CFA or the future of the Afro Dollar. It was the birth of a new political awareness on the continent. The tension was rising. The silence in diplomatic corridors announced that something bigger was approaching. As debates intensified in Ouagadougou, Paris went on high alert. The currency that had guaranteed France an invisible presence in the African economy for 75 years was beginning to slip from its control. The CFA franc, a pillar of post-colonial influence, trembled for the first time before an initiative that came neither from Brussels nor Washington, but from the Sahel itself. On September 25, 2025, President Emmanuel Macron addressed the National Assembly with an unusual tone of urgency. France will not accept that its former monetary zone becomes the battleground of foreign powers. Behind the scenes, French diplomats admitted their fear of losing not just economic control, but the symbolic control that of being seen as the indispensable power. An advisor confided to the press that African independence is a noble idea until it threatens our banks. European newspapers reacted with ambiguity. Le Monde published, "We defend African sovereignty, but only to the point where it doesn't cost us too much." The rhetoric changed, but the structure remained. France was now positioning itself as a defender of African sovereignty, not on principle, but for political survival. And paradoxically, the more it spoke of freedom, the more it sounded like a guardian of the past. While Paris spoke, Beijing acted. Without solemn announcements or inflamed declarations, China silently expanded its network of influence. Within weeks, the People's Bank of China launched the Digital Yuan Africa program, connecting financing, infrastructure projects, and energy contracts under a single digital payment system. The strategy was clear: replace Western intermediation with a new form of dependence, this time technological and financial. Ports in Kenya, railways in Ethiopia, and power plants in Djibouti began to operate partially in digital yuan, eliminating the dollar and euro from transactions. Chinese officials presented the initiative as mutual cooperation, but IMF analysts saw in it the embryo of a Sino-African economic sphere. A European diplomat commented, with a hint of irony, "The United States wants to free Africa with dollars. China wants to save it with code." Suddenly, the continent found itself at the center of a three-currency game: CFA franc, the legacy of France; Afro Dollar, the American project; digital yuan, the Chinese tool. Africa was no longer just an observer on the global chessboard. It was the chessboard. On the dawn of October 2, 2025, the Ouagadougou Convention Center hosted delegations of economists, ministers, and representatives from 5 African central banks. The atmosphere was solemn, yet without pomp. What was announced here could redefine the continent's financial map. President Ibrahim Traoré spoke cautiously, knowing that every sentence would be scrutinized by Washington, Paris, and Beijing. "Monetary sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a necessity," he said. Thus was born the ACI African Currency Initiative, a project conceived not as an emotional response, but as a technical and strategic alternative. The plan called for the creation of a common African currency, backed by the continent's own resources: gold from Burkina Faso and Mali oil from Nigeria, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the agricultural strength of the Sahel. The proposal also included the creation of an African Monetary Council, composed not only of ministers and bankers, but also of rural cooperatives, agricultural associations, and local credit institutions. The idea was simple but revolutionary: to give back to the base of society the power to define the value of its own economy. Traoré did not speak of rupture or revenge. He only said, "We do not seek to break with the world, but to walk standing before it." The Western press labeled the speech as prudent, yet bold. For many observers, it was less a political gesture and more an attempt to rebalance the global board. The news spread like dry fire. In a few days, radio programs in Accra, Lagos, and Niamey were discussing the concept of currency backed by real resources. On social media, the topic gained traction under the hashtag #Dar1 Africa One Currency. Regional surveys showed that 72% of Africans supported the idea of an independent continental currency. For many, it wasn't about nationalism, but economic dignity. "We want to work and be paid in African value," said a professor in Bamako. Governments reacted unevenly. Nigeria sent observers to discuss integration. South Africa requested time to study the model. Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, dependent on French financial ties, maintained a calculated silence. In Washington, the Treasury Department described the ACI as a risky experiment with the potential for instability. In Paris, authorities said that France respects African sovereignty, but fears unpredictable consequences. And in Beijing, spokespersons offered technical support in blockchain and payment systems, provided the project remains open to Chinese cooperation. Despite the contradictory reactions, one truth was emerging: Africa was ceasing to be a spectator and becoming the protagonist of the conversation about its own money. On that day, many realized that the ACI represented something bigger than a currency. It was an attempt to restore the power of decision over the value of their own land, labor, and future. With the ACI officially presented, the continent faced a historical crossroads. Three paths each, with promises and pitfalls. The first was the Afro Dollar Washington's project. It offered immediate liquidity, technological infrastructure, and global integration, but between the lines, also the supervision of the Federal Reserve and Wall Street. Many saw in this a new form of dependence freedom, bought with interest. The second path was the CFA franc, the legacy of stability and predictability. However, it rested on a foundation that no longer convinced the new generations. As an economist at the University of Lomé observed, "Stability that does not generate prosperity is just a well-managed prison." And the third was the most uncertain: the African currency proposed by the ACI. It demanded time sacrifices and unprecedented continental coordination. But it offered something neither of the other options could: the possibility of a value defined by the continent itself. "It is not a choice between right and wrong," summarized a Ghanaian analyst. "It is a choice about who dictates the future, us or others." From that moment on, the debate stopped revolving around leaders or slogans. Ibrahim Traoré was not seen as a savior, but as the spokesperson for a collective dilemma. African governments discussed how to harmonize fiscal policies, control inflation, and prevent the ideal of sovereignty from turning into economic chaos. Experts warned that the failure of the ACI could mean decades of discredit. Yet something had changed. For the first time, the issue of independence was not limited to flags and anthems. It reached the sphere of money, the invisible instrument of all dependencies. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou, when the national radio loudspeakers broadcast the latest news about the new African initiative. There were no celebrations, no triumphant speeches, just the serene sound of a continent beginning to think with its own voice. In the squares, farmers discussed the value of corn and gold. In the universities, young people analyzed graphs and economic models. The topic was no longer the Afro Dollar or the CFA franc, it was Africa's capacity to define alone the weight of its own labor. A veteran commentator summarized with lucidity, "Freedom is not bought, it is built." Burkina Faso, small on the map, had become a symbol of a difficult but necessary choice to be the master of one's own destiny, even if the path is long and uncertain. The dilemmas remain political, economic, morale, but something essential was recovered: the right to decide. And perhaps in that silence of the African evening, the world realized that true power is not in who prints the money, but in who believes in the value of what they produce. If you believe that truth and sovereignty walk together, share this story. Subscribe to follow the future of Burkina Faso and African news.